present her research, Dr. Milica Увалич. Dr. Milica Увалич is a full professor in economics at the Department of Political Science in the University of Perujji. She works in the University of Perujji for nearly 30 years. And recently she worked in the Department of Economics and Finance and Statistics. Formerly, Dr. Увалич was a member of United Nations Committee for Development Policy, Public Policy Scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., and also Vice Minister in the federal government of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. I would like to give a floor to Dr. Увалич.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me and see me?
Yes. Yes.
Fine. Well, I'm very pleased and honored to have been invited to this conference in honor of Svetlana Glинкина that I met personally at various conferences on this big project of the transition in Eastern Europe in the 90s already. And in fact, I much appreciated her work, and she was certainly one of the most distinguished scholars in this area. She was also present in our European Association for Comparative Economic Studies, and of course, we will all miss her and her contributions to this important field. Now, let me just load my presentation, which should come out immediately. Do you see my presentation?
Yes. Yes.
Challenges of economic development in the Western Balkans. Okay. Well, being from the Balkans, I've really spent my life looking at this part of Eastern Europe, and of course comparing what has been going on in the Balkans with respect to the rest of Eastern Europe. And well, I'm trying to go down, but my presentation is blocked for some reason. But okay, so I'll have to use it. Okay, so during my 15 minutes presentation, I would like to say something about long-term growth in the Western Balkans. Then I will pass on to some of the structural problems of these countries, and finally, some of the main current challenges. And of course, in my presentation, I will be taking into account primarily the countries that are still in the Western Balkan region, because in the meantime, of course, we know that Croatia joined the European Union in 2013. So we're basically talking about the Western Balkan 6. Now, long-term growth in the Western Balkans. Now here, I have to say that the whole picture is quite discouraging, because if we look at the three phases of economic development in the Western Balkans since 1989, at the time when Yugoslavia still existed, we see that the first decade was actually a decade of extreme political instability, which had a very concrete and long-term economic consequences, not only for economic performance, but for the transition, for integration with the EU. And so it is not by chance that the 1990s are usually have been referred to as the lost decade. All the effects of that followed the breakup of Yugoslavia in 1991. Then we had the second phase, which was a period of relatively fast economic growth from 2001 until 2008, where we see that many countries, even those that were lagging behind, tried to accelerate economic reforms. We see finally the arrival of foreign direct investment. We also see gradual integration, economic integration of these countries with the EU. And it was also a growth model very much based on increasing reliance on foreign capital. This positive trend was interrupted at the end of 2008 when the crisis hit these countries as well very, very severely. And then we have a period of, we have 10 years of a notable growth slowdown and reversions in economic recovery. And here we see that, in fact, during the last 30 years, we have had a very poor growth record, except for part of the 2000s. And this is a graph that actually shows the strong impact of the global economic crisis on these countries. We see that the average GDP growth in 2009-2019 has actually been much lower than the pre-crisis average. Even in countries that have not had negative growth after 2008, like Albania or Kosovo, we can note notable slowdown. Serbia has actually had 3 recessions during these last 10 years, and its growth rate, average growth rate for the post-crisis period has been about 1/6 of what was achieved before the crisis. Another graph to illustrate how after 2009, most of these countries have actually stagnated with respect to the EU average GDP per capita. Now here, of course, it's always useful to compare the Western Balkans with the new member states. And we see that, in fact, with the only exception of Montenegro, there has been very slow recovery with respect to the GDP per capita in the European Union of 27 member states. And therefore, there has absolutely been no convergence of the Western Balkans income levels to the EU level, except for Montenegro. And somehow, of course, Central and East European countries, the Baltics, they were also very much hit by the global economic crisis. But at least more recently, we see that they have been recovering much faster than the Western Balkans. And so it is not by chance that we find that the last data available tells us that these countries are still at the level of 31 to 50% of the average GDP per capita of the European Union. But this excludes Kosovo, which is even less developed, but we don't have data, precise data, where it stands exactly. Another third graph showing these long-term patterns of growth regarding recovery of 1989 real GDP. We saw in Professor Havel's presentation how things were from 95 onwards and only in Central and Eastern Europe. But here, including the Western Balkans, you can actually note, and including the early 1990s, you can actually know that 2 of these countries in the Western Balkans have still not reached the 1989 real GDP. So certainly the Central East European countries, despite everything that's been discussed this morning, have done much better in terms of economic development. Of course, in this story, Albania is a notable exception. It was the poorest country in 1989, 1990, and therefore it started from a very low base. And not only Albania was not involved in the military conflicts of the other countries. And so actually, Serbia is the country that stands worse in terms of this indicator, precisely because it had a very strong fall, not as much as Bosnia and Herzegovina. Bosnia and Herzegovina was involved in a war for 4 years, but we see that Serbia still recovered very, very slowly. This brings me to the structural problems of these countries, because the global economic and financial crisis actually brought to the surface a number of structural problems of these economies that somehow remained in the shadow of the positive trends from 2001 onwards. But these countries have been facing increasing imbalances on external accounts. Foreign trade recovered very fast, even in countries that had very little foreign trade before. But they were accompanied by increasing current account deficits, and therefore somehow still today the Western Balkans do not have, they're insufficiently competitive on global markets. And we will see it through an indicator I'll show you in a second. The second group of huge problems are labor markets. These countries still have very high unemployment rates, very low employment rates. There's a widespread shadow economy, and of course, all the related social problems. There's been a huge brain drain. Young people, the best professionals are leaving these countries in order to find better paid jobs in the European Union. And therefore, clearly, with such low employment rates, these countries remain with a GDP growth below potential. And the third group of problems is linked to the rapid structural changes. As elsewhere, there has been a strong deindustrialization, but somehow the Western Balkans have seen a stronger process of deindustrialization in comparison to the Central East European countries, and they have had more difficulties in implementing a stronger export-led growth. Also, in part due to the structure of FDI, I will come back to that, because FDI, at least during the first decade, has mainly gone into non-tradable service sectors. So just illustrating what I have said through three graphs. This is about external imbalances, exports of goods and services, GDP ratios. This graph shows that there has been substantial improvements. Serbia, North Macedonia has doubled the ratio, and so has Serbia. But still, if we compare the Western Balkans with the new member states, we see that the ratio remains lower in most countries with respect to most new EU member states that have much higher exports of GDP ratios. Labor market indicators, I cannot go more into details, but the unemployment rates in Kosovo, in Bosnia, in North Macedonia, despite a declining trend, still remain extremely high in comparison to the trend in the European Union. The same is can be noticed with the employment rate. In the European Union, we're striving to reach the 75% employment rate on average, and we're almost there. Most countries are almost there, but we see that these countries still have very low employment rates, or in most cases. Albania has been an exception for quite a while. And then if we look at structural changes, here again, we see a stronger process of deindustrialization with respect to the new member states. The contribution of the manufacturing value added to GDP is even in the most industrialized country, Serbia, is below the average for the whole European Union. And of course, not speaking about countries like the Czech Republic or Slovenia, Slovak Republic, but even Germany. Germany has a 20% contribution of the manufacturing sector to GDP. So all these structural problems, of course, merit an explanation. Why are they so much present in the Western Balkans? And of course, the 1990s are the main cause or the main explanation, the delayed transition. But it's not that the transition was simply delayed for 10 years. During the first 10 years, there were these distorted patterns of development, which had very long economic and social consequences. The second group of motives we certainly find in EU policies towards the Western Balkans that were certainly very different for obvious reasons than for Central and Eastern European countries. And now we are actually seeing support of the Western Balkan region since the year 2000 with the launch of the Stabilization and Association process. But support of these countries has come under much stricter conditionality. It's not only the Copenhagen criteria, it's also respect of international treaties, regional cooperation, and also now, since recently, fundamentals first, which really have to do with the rule of law, public administration reform, economic governance, and so a longer process of accession. But last but not least, policy failures. Policy failures after the changed political climate after 2001. There were really high expectations that the replication of policies that have been implemented earlier in Central and Eastern Europe would actually bring similar results. Also in the Balkans, there was a glorification of the liberal growth model based on fast trade and financial liberalization and so on, the Washington consensus we heard about this morning, and increasing dependence on foreign capital. And the model has really been much less successful in the Western Balkans than in Central and Eastern Europe. I'm running in order to arrive to my conclusions, current challenges. What do we do? What are the remedies today after 30 years? What are the main challenges in the Western Balkans? Now, I think the main challenge should really be how to accelerate economic development, also perhaps questioning the growth model that has been implemented so far. It is only through much stronger growth that these countries can actually catch up and compensate for the lost decades. And of course, today, we also see that these countries are economically quite integrated with the EU economy, and therefore there are many issues that are not in their direct control, which are beyond direct control, because in fact, 70% of trade is with the EU, 70% of FDI arrives from the EU, and so on, and also banking sector integration. But despite all this high level of integration with the EU, I think that three issues really merit to be given more attention. In the first place, more effective industrial policy. In the second place, more fundamental reforms of the public administration and in general institutional reforms. And finally, the third issue, which I think is very important, is to remove the current ambiguities about future EU enlargements. So I don't know how much time I have used, but I would like to just reflect on these three main issues. Now, industrial policy in the Western Balkans really has to be in the function of much faster economic development. Horizontal measures are not sufficient, and these are the measures that have been also advised to these countries since the early 1990s. The Western Balkans definitely need a more focused industrial policy in line with national priorities, to promote restructuring, to diversify the industrial base, technological upgrading, and so on and so on. And today they can also rely on these smart specialization strategies, which are being prepared with the help of the European Commission to choose the priority sectors, the directions in which they want to go according to comparative advantage. But these countries also need stronger measures to stimulate investment, and not only foreign investment, but very much domestic investment. There has because excessive reliance on FDI is a very risky policy. We've heard from Professor Inotai's contribution this morning how, in fact, many foreign investors have left Hungary in the meantime. And in the case of the Western Balkans, you know, improving the business environment will not attract additional foreign investors, because even the best policies may not eliminate some of the disadvantages of this region, unfortunately, like small size, fragmentation, lack of economies of scale, and political risk. Let's be clear, it's still there. And then it's important to influence the sectoral distribution of investment, and therefore sector targeting, because a better challenging of investment towards higher value-added, tradable sector and other priority sectors is very important. There are many things that need to be said about industrial policy, also about creating local networks, which are definitely not there. In Serbia, 70% of inputs of foreign firms actually continue to be imported from abroad, and therefore domestic firms are not integrated sufficiently into global supply chains. About public administration and institutional reforms, of course, if you want some success with your economic policies, you need fundamental reforms of government and non-governmental institutions that can, in fact, more efficiently promote investment, support innovation, policy-induced specialization, but also be able to enforce laws, collect taxes, fight corruption. These are all problems that are very much present in all the Western Balkan countries, and therefore the quality of institutions really matters very much. We've heard about it from Professor Miklos this morning about importance of institutions, and much more than long-established traditional factor endowments, trade, or technology transfer. And here I would just like to illustrate the problem of institutions, the importance of the quality of institutions through these bicycles that were invented by Portuguese economist Andrés Rodrigues Posé, where in fact in a normal situation you have institutions that are pushing your strategy. In countries with weak institutions, you can present it like an 18th century bicycle. But in reality, countries with weak institutions frequently end up having a bicycle with square wheels. And in fact, this has somehow been the case in most Western Balkan countries. Most countries, all countries, have elaborated numerous and over-ambitious strategies which often remain on paper due to weak public administration and poor implementation capacity. And here I come to my last slide. I'm sorry, I have not taken track of time, which has to do with relations with the European Union. I think it is high time to try and remove the ambiguities regarding future EU enlargements, and I would say on both sides, because it's been 20 years that the EU has announced the prospects of EU membership to the Western Balkans, but progress, as we all know, has been extremely slow. Only Croatia managed to enter in 2013. And especially recently, during the last 2 years, we have seen rising ambiguities regarding future EU enlargements towards the Balkans, despite many initiatives, the Berlin process launched by Angela Merkel, but also the new EU methodology, recent optimistic statements, documents, and so on. And 2 countries have already even opened negotiations on EU membership with the EU, Montenegro and Serbia. And finally, there's this new economic investment plan, which has been launched for the Western Balkans in October 2020. Which offers 9 billion of euros plus guarantees for potential future investment. But 9 billion euros is actually very little. It's extremely low amount of money if we look into the current budget of the EU for the next 7 years in comparison to what some of the, well, new member states after 15 years, I don't know, a country like Romania is going to get in the next 7 years. So it is certainly not enough to ensure convergence of the Western Balkans to EU income levels. In the meantime, in the Western Balkans, if we look at what has been happening in the meantime, we see increasing disillusionment, withering away of the belief and hope that they can ever join the EU. Reliance, of course, also on other external actors. Of course, these countries are poor, they need investment. So China has been a very much present in the region. We'll certainly hear more about it from Xavier Richet. But we have also seen rising authoritarianism, persistence of nationalistic policies, also because of the key political issues that have still not been resolved. So the only way out is to actually accelerate somehow the Western Balkan accession process, which seems highly unlikely given the present crisis in the EU. As an alternative, something needs to be done to strengthen the intermediate rewards in terms of financial support to these countries and access to perhaps additional EU programs. So this is the end of my presentation. I'm not sorry if I have been a little too long. And I'll be very happy to return to any of these questions during the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Увалич.